Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The US President Donald Trump urged India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Tuesday to improve ties with Pakistan and fulfill his promise to better the lives of the Kashmiri people. This was released in a statement by the White House after Trump met Modi on the sidelines of the 74th UN General Assembly session. We shall talk about that shortly with reference to growing tension in South Asia following India's arbitrary and unilateral decision to change the status quo in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. There's also a lot of problem with the way Trump is approaching this. And I think the real thing has actually been done by the UK's Labour Party, which has actually asked that Kashmiris be given the right to self-determination. But we shall get back to it, as I said, shortly. For now, let's look at some excerpts from Trump's remarks at the UNGA session. He said the essential divide that runs all around the world and throughout history is once again thrown into stark relief. It is the divide between those whose thirst for control deludes them into thinking they are destined to rule over others, and those people and nations who want only to rule themselves. I don't have to say that there is deep irony in these words, but let's go to another excerpt. He says the future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special and unique. And then he went on to say, as we rebuild the unrivaled might of the American military, we also revitalizing our alliances by making it very clear that all of our partners are expected to pay their fair share of the tremendous defense burden which the United States has borne in the past. Now, I have former Ambassador Matthew Bryza with me from Istanbul, and I'm going to ask him to give us a sort of overview of the US foreign policy if we were to take the September to September as the political year of the UNGA sessions from 73rd to 74th. But before that, here's a quote from Stephen Walt, who's a structural realist, and his book, The Hell to Good Intentions. And he says, at its core, liberal hegemony sought to remake world politics in America's image and for America's benefit. Despite its overweening ambition, it is not surprising that the strategy attracted wide support in the wake of America's Cold War triumph. By portraying US values as the ideal model for others and assigning Washington primary responsibility for peace, prosperity, and progress, the strategy appealed to Americans' sense of virtue and self-regard. It also gave the foreign policy community in Washington a new and lofty purpose, while making those idealistic goals seem easy to achieve. End of quote. Ambassador Bryza, there was the neoliberal thought, and now you have Trump. And Trump is neither really, conceptually speaking, a structural realist nor a neoliberal. Where exactly does he fit?
That's a great question. I think he fits nowhere, because I don't think President Trump has ever considered any of these questions or foreign policy at all. You know, he is basically a real estate developer from New York City that had mixed success, and then was involved in TV, and never really, I don't think, has even been curious about history or about foreign policy. So he doesn't have any of these concepts. What he is de facto, I suppose, is a neo-realist in the extreme. Meaning he is in favor of the United States worrying almost exclusively about itself and about isolating individual countries, even those that are allies and members of our alliance like NATO. He prefers, though, to deal with them one-on-one, because the U.S. will always be stronger. And then the U.S. will grow. That is completely alien to my own upbringing in U.S. foreign policy, whether I'm considered a realist or a liberal. What we have always thought, since World War II, when we learned our biggest lesson, is that we and everyone are much better off when the democracies of the world are working together in a collective way. And that's why we set up the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. The idea was that global prosperity is good for the United States because everybody else will be more stable and we won't see a repeat of previously endless conflicts between France and Germany, for example. So President Trump is unique in terms of practitioners of U.S. foreign policy in the modern era.
So here's the thing. When he says the era of the globalists is over, now, globalism essentially was a rules-based kind of order, primarily flowing forth from the U.S. Foreign policy neoliberal thought. But there were other countries that also got into it. It created a certain kind of normative, acceptance of these rules. But here's the thing. Within that normative framework, this also came to bite the U.S. in many ways. And most of the U.S. administration kind of tried to circumvent it, but at the same time also grudgingly accepted it. Trump doesn't seem to agree with that at all. He feels that the U.S., he has taken the kind of U.S. exceptionalism that has always been a sort of strand within the U.S. foreign policy to another extreme altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're making the same point in slightly different ways. And I think you articulated it extremely well just now. He's taking this sense of American exceptionalism to an extreme. But there are two elements of American exceptionalism in my mind. There's a negative piece, which is arrogance. And the quote you were reading kind of reflects that, the sense of American exceptionalism most definitely appeals to Americans' sense of self-importance and big power status. That's the ugly side. The positive side is Americans truly do like to believe, true liberals, I mean, that there's something special about America because of the way it was founded essentially by English philosophers during the Enlightenment, and because of the belief in the power of political and economic freedom. And just think back to U.S. administrations, to President George W. Bush, who on the one hand showed the ugly side of American exceptionalism. But on the other side, if you read his second inaugural address, it's quite an uplifting and downright beautiful articulation of the purpose of the United States being to maximize political and economic freedom around the world, but in the specific cultural context of each country, which is something that seems quite different from the way the war in Iraq, and in Afghanistan has been conducted.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Ambassador Matthew Bryza speaking to us, a certain sort of, overview of the U.S. foreign policy under President Trump. But let me hop over to Ambassador Durrani and go back to where I started, which was with reference to what Trump said to Narendra Modi on the sidelines of the UNGA session. Ambassador Durrani, Trump said that India needs to talk to Pakistan, which is fine. That's a bilateral thing. But he also said that India has to give Kashmiris what Modi has promised. Now, Modi has promised basically nothing. What he has done is to annex an occupied territory. And then he has been dangling this development carrot while depriving the Kashmiris of their political rights, their human rights, and their self-dignity. So what do you make of this? Is it significant in any way?
I think what you said is actually you have answered yourself. Reason being that President Trump, he has been running with the hare and hunting with the hound when it comes to Pakistan, or Pakistan's issues with India are concerned. Because when he is with Modi, he is sold to Modi, he is sold to India. And he says that I'm in love with Hindus, I'm in love with India. When he meets Mr. Khan, Imran Khan, then he praises Imran Khan, he praises Pakistan, and then he talks about Kashmir to the extent just to sound music to our ears. But he doesn't mean it because, and I'm very cautious about whatever Mr. Trump says. Really, I cannot believe that because unless it is proven, I'm proven wrong, or it is proven otherwise. So,
no, I tend to agree with you. Would you also suggest that, there was a certain sense of elation, shall I say, in Pakistan, about the fact, I won't say in Pakistan, but at least in the government, that President Trump has constantly been talking about the tensions in South Asia, and that he could possibly do something about it and end up in the role of a facilitator or an arbiter. Do you think that sense is correct?
I don't think so. Reason being that we are unnecessarily enthusiastic about what Mr. Trump is saying, because just rewind Trump's speech in Houston at Rowdy Modi event. And then when he meets Modi again in New York, and when he talks to us, there's nothing concrete he has said about Kashmir, the problem we are facing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In which case, tell me, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn and his party seems to have got the full measure of what the problem is. That it's not about the development carrot, it's not about anything else. It's essentially, centrally about the Kashmiris' right to self-determination. And they have actually passed a resolution, the Labour Party, and the Indian media is crying blue murder and saying that, this is something which the Labour Party should not have done. But we now have at least one international player and one major political party in the UK that seems to have hit the nail on the head.
You're right, but Labour Party has a history. I recall in 1995 and 96 when they had their party conferences, annual party conferences. So again, Labour Party had a very clear resolution about the right to self-determination of the Kashmiri people. And again, Indians were not happy with the Labour Party. Normally, when you look at in the British politics, then their Indians were uncomfortable whenever Labour Party was in power. And they had special, and then again, Pakistan diaspora in UK, they mostly, by and large, they support Labour Party. Even if you look at the number of MPs and number of councillors elected, because I've been a Deputy High Commissioner there from 2019-11 onwards, so there has been a clear divide on that. Of course, Pakistan diaspora as well as Kashmiri, they are part of Conservative Party as well. But mostly it's Labour Party has always gone out of the way in supporting the Kashmir cause.
So we should actually, exploit that, because that is something that needs to be targeted in our campaign to highlight the fact that India is oppressing Kashmiris. But thank you so much. That was Ambassador Asif Durrani with us speaking about what Trump said to Modi on the sidelines of the conference. But let's move on to certain other aspects of President Trump's speech at the UNGA, and I'm joined by Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung, who is joining me from Hong Kong. He is the chairman of Andrew Leung International Consultants. So let me just read out a couple of excerpts from President Trump's speech with a reference to what he said about international trade. And I quote, "At the center of our vision for national renewal is an ambitious campaign to reform international trade. For decades, the international trading system has been easily exploited by nations acting in very bad faith. As jobs were outsourced, a small handful grew wealthy at the expense of the middle class. In America, the result was 4.2 million lost manufacturing jobs and $15 trillion in trade deficits over the last quarter century. The United States is now taking that decisive action to end this grave economic injustice. Our goal is simple. We want balanced trade that is both fair and reciprocal. The most important difference in America's new approach on trade concerns our relationship, yes, you guessed it, with China. In 2001, China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. Our leaders then argued that this decision would compel China to liberalize its economy and strengthen protections to provide things that were unacceptable to us and for private property and for the rule of law. 2 decades later, this theory has been tested and proven completely wrong. Not only has China declined to adopt promised reforms, it has embraced an economic model dependent on massive market barriers, heavy state subsidies, currency manipulation, product dumping, forced technology transfers, and the theft of intellectual property, and also trade secrets on a grand scale. Now, these are, Mr. Leung, you would agree, very harsh words against China, but they're not new. And many of these complaints were also voiced by the Obama administration. So what would you say about this ongoing sort of trade war between the U.S. and China?
I think that the people have got to understand it is not just a trade war. It is a 360 degrees pushback by the United States, and there is a consensus across the aisle. Both parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they have a common consensus that China represents a threat not only on trade, but on technology, on ideology, military, on the South China Sea, and also perceived deficit of human rights. And above all, China's economy is growing, is now already the world's second largest economy, and would overtake the United States in about 10 years. So the threat is a country rising, challenging the dominance of the United States, and indeed a country with a different regime and odds with a lot of values embraced by the United States. So I think that you can see that this confrontation is intensifying, and then even if there is a trade deal, the deal would only be temporary and would not stop all these kind of...
That's a very interesting observation, Mr. Leung. But let me go back to something that I pointed out earlier, which is that while President Trump obviously is now very gung-ho about how he's going to pressure China, but these issues haven't just arisen. They've been there for a long time. We remember that President Obama's administration also talked about these issues, intellectual theft and the rest of it and all of that. But they weren't so aggressive about taking on China. President Trump obviously has taken a different kind of turn on this. And as you just said, the deal is not going to last. So tell me, if that is the scenario, and if both sides stick to their positions, then what exactly is the world economy looking at?
Well, as you said, I mean, this kind of conflict is not only recent. It hasn't happened only under President Trump. In fact, back in Obama's time, there is the so-called pivot to Asia, also trying to push back against China. But then as the years go by, there's a realization that China is challenging the United States, and not only on trade matters, maybe the perceived unfair trade practices, the stolen intellectual property, and also keeping on closing certain parts of its economy. And the United States sees that as unfair. But even more so, the China's technological advancement is by leaps and bounds. So China is now even overtaking the United States in 5G, for example. And of course, 5G has a great deal of national security considerations. So that's why the whole process is now coalesced into a bipartisan consensus to push back against China on all fronts.
So do you think that this is essentially the beginning of the end of global trade as it was conceived in the WTO?
Well, of course, the Trump administration doesn't have a great deal of faith in the World Trade Organization. The Americans sees that all these rules were made a long time and have now served its sell-by date, and does not cope with the kind of a new situation of a big China economy connecting to the rest of the world, and still continuing with some of these problematic trade practices. So there is not only there is a demand for the reform of the WTO, in fact the demand is from China itself as well, who is also aware of all these challenges. But then President Trump really threatens to leave the WTO altogether and concentrate not on bilateral trade relations, but on not on multilateral trade relations, but on bilateral trade relations. where the United States can exert its influence. And also, there is also the consensus that perhaps the United States needs to decouple from the China's economy, and especially in terms of technology, and it's lying up with its allies. Now, against that trend, though, we are seeing that China's the world trade is now coalescing towards Asia. In fact, over something like 47% of the trade.
In fact, I think you'll agree with me that a lot of Chinese production is now actually traveling towards domestic consumption because the domestic market, consumer market, is also growing in a big way.
That's true. As China's economy has now shifted away from dependence on exports, dependence on overseas export markets, to internal consumption. But nevertheless, even for internal consumption, there are lots of manufacturing which, say, American companies, European companies are involved. And then there are various supply parts and components which have got to be imported from all over the world. And of course, even energy, oil and gas.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung speaking with us about what China and the U.S. trade war looks like and how it's going to impact global trade. Also, as I said, I also have Mr. Mark Meirowitz with us. Dr. Meirowitz, he specializes in Turkish foreign policy, joins us from New York. Dr. Meirowitz, thank you so much. As we move forward, and I was actually looking at like the September to September UNGA sessions as the political year, and just getting a sort of sense of the U.S. foreign policy under President Trump. How would you look at U.S.-Turkey relations given the problems with the Turkish purchase of S-400 A280 system, the U.S. separation of Turkey from the F-35 program, also problems in dealing with Syria?
In order to understand the foreign policy, we have to understand domestic policy and what's going on with Trump and all of this impeachment talk. This is extremely distracting and will be very impactful on how the United States formulates its foreign policy to China, to Turkey, to Russia, globally. On the China side, just a quick point, and then I'll turn to Turkey, which is your focus. I think what President Trump talked about was very realistic. I think that China should listen carefully to what the United States is saying. The actions of China, the South China Sea, and all of the other activities that the president talked about are very serious and very important, and we don't want to have another Cold War with China. That would be my point. So that I think the best way is, and as Trump said, is negotiation. At the same time, on Turkey, when President Trump dealt with this issue, he basically blamed the fact that Turkey didn't get the Patriots on President Obama, which was really deconflicting it and really, tamping down the tension on it completely. The United States did not place any sanctions on Turkey for the S-400s. And what it did was stop, at least at this point, the F-35 program for Turkey, but that could be re-upped again. So I think right now, and I would also say that the NATO head also was very conciliatory, as was Trump on this issue. So this issue is very problematic, but right now I think we're at a point where the United States and NATO have really not sanctioned or if I could punish Turkey for this, and hopefully the relations will continue to get better, and we won't have any further issues like this. But we can't really tell.
Okay, final quick question. The S-400 purchase is now a fait accompli, so that's not Turkey is not going to reverse that. And I'm assuming that Washington's decision to separate Turkey from the F-35 program is also something that is not going to be reversed. So what space are we talking about in terms of improved relations?
Let's make 2 points. First, the F-35, what that was done was to separate the F-35 from the S-400. And I think there's been some talk about the F-35s or Patriots, or maybe the United States giving Turkey the Patriots. So there's room for improvement. Where I think the improved relations come is hopefully if Turkey doesn't go, I mean, again, I don't know, down the road with Russia and start taking more Russian ordnance like the Sukhoi fighters and S-500s. This is the imponderable in this relationship. That would be very problematic. But I wanted to go back to my point, which I think you didn't maybe hear, which is the impact of domestic politics on foreign policy is very important. And I think this new impeachment issues, but all the problems domestically do tend to influence President Trump not to exacerbate foreign tensions with foreign powers. This is why I think he took more conciliatory point on this. And also, I don't think the United States wants to have multiple adversaries at the same time. The main adversary right now is Iran. Iran is in the speech that Trump gave at the UN, is the main adversary. He focuses on that. He also focuses on China, but on China, he wants the trade deal. This is why his rhetoric is so strong.
I agree with you, Dr. Meirowitz, and I think, yes, you are absolutely right about Iran. And in fact, we're going to take a short break at this point and return to discuss U.S.-Iran relations and also U.S. overview of the foreign policy in the greater Middle East. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing President Trump's speech and how reflective that speech at the UNGA of U.S. foreign policy. And, you know, we've been discussing what he said about China, about South Asia. We also had a certain overview of where exactly does he fit in, whether he's a realist, a neoliberal, or what, or is he sui generis in terms of how he approaches a foreign policy. Now, among other things, he also had very harsh words for Iran. And he said that, I don't have the excerpt here, but essentially he said that Iran is responsible for all its troubles. And he also, and I think wrongly, said that Iran, despite the deal, was still working towards creating a nuclear capability, which goes against what the IAEA inspectors said or the IAEA reports say. But he also talked about Iran's missile development, which was obviously not covered by the JCPOA. And yes, also about Iran's power projection, as he put it, in the greater Middle East. So I'm joined by Hamidreza Gholamzadeh from Tehran. Mr. Gholamzadeh is an analyst. Thank you for being on the program. I'm sure you have either heard or read President Trump's speech, and specifically the paragraphs about Iran. This comes on the heels of the attacks on the Saudi oil facility and all of that. So where do things stand?
We are actually some sort of accustomed to the U.S. foreign policy being based on demonizing against the others. The United States has always, in recent decades, needed an other, actually, to otherize someone, to put all the blames on that and to make fear based on that, and by demonizing that, justify its own foreign policy, its intrusive foreign policy, actually. So all the aggressions that it wants to make, all the extensive policies that it wants to follow, all the wars that they want to monger, are based on a demonization of an other country. Now, the other is Iran. President Trump, which has not been actually successful in putting forward any of its foreign policy agendas, neither in Venezuela nor in North Korea. The trade war against China has failed to some extent. The policy toward Russia is actually another story. In Syria, it has failed. In Afghanistan, the talks with Taliban failed, and now we have Iran. So it is actually in such a situation. Neither the aggressive policies nor the supportive policies for regimes have been successful. So there is no other option but to resort to some country to blame and play a blame game on against that, and that is Iran now. The scenario is now Iran, and demonize Iran and saying everything about that. And we know that we are living in a post-truth era right now, in an era where you don't need to provide any facts, you don't need to provide any evidence, and whatever you can say, that can be considered as the truth, as far as you are so proud to consider that, just like President Trump is. He says Iran is #1 state sponsor of terrorism, and that's all. When he says so, he believes that it is the truth. And he says that Iran has been violating the Iran deal, and we know that, quote unquote, he has said that Iran has even violated the deal even before the deal was actually signed. So that is the president that we are talking about. His foreign policy has not been something sustainable. There has been nothing actually united in that. No cohesion we can see in that. We know that we have had several national security advisors changed, and every time we have seen some changes in the foreign policy. We have seen two foreign Secretary of States changed, and that's the story that we are.
But Mr. Gholamzadeh, here's the thing. Let me just offer an alternative argument also, because we don't have an American to talk about the U.S. foreign policy. Let me try and put that hat on. Now, here's the thing. As far as the JCPOA is concerned, I think a number of American analysts themselves criticized President Trump's decision to unilaterally walk out of that multilateral, UN-sanctioned, agreement. But the Trump administration has been talking about something bigger than just the JCPOA, including Iran's power projection in the greater Middle East, and also the Iranian missile program. Now, let's forget about the missile program, but as far as the Iranian power projection in the greater Middle East is concerned, and the Iranian role in sustaining Bashar al-Assad's regime, which one can very clearly argue is an extremely murderous regime, that is something which I do not think, since you talked about facts, one cannot avoid that fact. I mean, when I talk to the Iranian friends, they try to select their own facts. So, what would you say about that? Because that's something which is crucial here.
You know, when we are talking about international relations and the global politics, it is different from domestic politics of the countries. If President Bashar al-Assad is a bad president, it is for their own people. It is the Syrian people who should decide about that.
But the Syrian people stood against him. They stood up. They said, "We don't want you." But the regime started oppressing them, and that's the fact.
There are actually documents that the ISIS was created by the United States. They have confession that. Michael Flynn has admitted that. President Trump has admitted that. And we know that President Obama was behind the formation of ISIS, and they wanted to, quote unquote, deliberately allow ISIS to form to actually weaken the Syrian government. And on the other side, the point is that when it comes to Iran's cooperation with Syria, it is about security of the region. Iran helped Syria, Iran helped Lebanon, Iran helped Iraq, Iran helped anywhere where terrorism is killing people, where terrorism is actually threatening the security of the region. That was the story. Iran was not involved in any of the revolutions that happened across the region, and it even didn't involve in Syria until it was actually clear that it was terrorists. They were al-Nusra and...
Okay, thank you. That was Hamidreza Gholamzadeh speaking with us with reference to President Trump's remarks about Iran. I am now joined by Ahmed Jamal El-Ahmed, who's an analyst based in Accra. Thank you, Ahmed, for being on the program. We're looking at Trump's speech, and while he had harsh words for Iran, he had praise for Israel. Just the other day, Israeli police arrested the Palestinian Authority's Jerusalem Affairs Minister, Fadi al-Haddami. It's actually the second time in 3 months. And generally, analysts say, well, this is something which they keep doing. Now, given Trump's approach to the Middle East and his approach to Israel, give us a sense of what kind of problems it creates in terms of actually factually looking at things and resolving these issues.
Well, thank you for having me. I think what the Trump administration has given Israel is a carte blanche, a green light to pretty much do everything that they were restrained from doing under the Obama administration and to some extent under the Clinton and Bush administrations. It's no surprise that Netanyahu has a personal relationship with Trump. But at the same time, we have to understand that Trump's overtures and relations with Israel has much to do with his base. So when he is active and engaging Israel and giving them this carte, he's actually doing what his base elected him to do. He's not doing it because he likes or hates Israel. No, it's more to do with his political interests and his re-election prospects.
So you were saying that this is actually based, this is grounded in domestic policy compulsions?
Majorly, yes, absolutely. Trump doesn't act because he thinks he's going to be doing good in a particular situation. He acts based on what his interests are and what his re-election prospects are going to be. One of the things Trump fears the most is not being re-elected. At the same time, Israel's posture in the Middle East is something Netanyahu has tried to increase, strengthen, and sustain for decades to come. And he's used Iran as a bogeyman. Israel needs an enemy, so it has to create, from Hezbollah to Hamas to Iran to, foreign terrorists operating in Syria, which in turn they go out and help treat with the medical service. So Israel, in a way, is doing Trump's bidding foreign policy in the Middle East. And that's something that we've seen for the past few years now.
So, Mr. Ahmed, tell me, let's cast a glance at the Israeli domestic politics, since you talked about Netanyahu and Netanyahu's close friendship with Trump. I believe Netanyahu is not going to be around. So what are we looking at now? Apart from the fact that hopefully Netanyahu would probably serve a jail term for financial misdemeanors and the rest of it. But what exactly are we looking at? Are we going to see any kind of positive change now?
With regards to the Israeli internal politics and its posture for the greater Middle East, no, because again, the Israeli president chose Netanyahu, gave him 2 weeks to form a new government. And if Netanyahu is unable to, which there are prospects that he may not be able to, Gantz will take over, or they'll follow whatever constitutional procedures they have. But if this will change Israel's internal dynamic, I don't think so very much vis-a-vis the greater Middle East. If you look at Israel's history with successive prime ministers and administrations, whether on the left or on the right, they pretty much sustained the status quo with regards to the Middle East. So I don't expect new changes. Again, with regards to the arresting of Palestinian officials, it's not the first time. It won't be the last time. They continue to harass. And anything they can do to subjugate and intimidate, they will do, because that's part of their forced posture.
That's part of their forced posture, so it's likely that we'll see any change. That was Ahmed Jamal El-Ahmed speaking with us. This is all for today from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.